So soil fertility. So I'm not going to wow you with anything, really revelating, but I want to reinforce what we've said before and present some newer data for Minnesota, in which complements what we had on our recommendations for quite some time. So I'm gonna go through nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, then sulfur, zinc. Other micros, really, there aren't any other micros, so I'm not really going to touch on that. But sulfur, zinc, certainly. So dry beans, of course, are a legume, and they can be inoculated with rhizobia, but its effect is very inconsistent. I mean, it's too wet, too dry, too cold, too hot. If the soil is too salty, all of those things infect it. Uh, my my belief is that the dry bean originated in a state in Mexico. Is actually the same state in Mexico where teosinte, the progenitor of corn, originated from. So, given that corn is really hungry for nutrients, and it must have developed under conditions of really high fertility, and dry beans the same way. And so their genetic makeup, it really doesn't have a very tight association with rhizobia because apparently in that state in Mexico, it didn't need it very much. So these things tend to carry their genetics with them wherever they go. That's my belief. That's what I think. So nitrogen and dry bean is really the first big project that I had when I came to NDSU in 1994. Worked on it for a couple of years in a couple sites at Carrington, up at Crookston, and really exciting yield response curve there. Return to N, no inoculation or inoculated. It didn't make that much difference whether you did or not. And using some economics, somewhere between 70 pounds, 100 pounds, something like that. That's kind of where our recommendations have been for almost 30 years. This is some recent work from Minnesota. Dan Kaiser's. I knew he was thinking about it, but I didn't know he actually did it. So he had some trials this last year on black and navy beans, and this is a response curve, which is a little bit weird because it's not a quadratic. It has it's a cubic. But the big deal is that the yield peaked at about 90 pounds of N per acre that's added in. He didn't share what the residual N or if it even makes a difference in wherever he was doing the studies in Minnesota. But that's about where we're looking at it. So I want to call your attention to the y-axis there on the right, or I mean there on the left. With 0 N, 3,300 pounds. So the soil is really providing quite a bit of nitrogen, and we found that with all of our crops in North Dakota and over across the border in Minnesota. It doesn't stop there. So where it's coming from, I'm not sure we know for sure where it's coming from. Certainly not all from mineralization. If we got all that nitrogen from mineralization, we'd have zero organic matter in about 10 years, and that hasn't happened. But I think it's just really important to understand that the yield increases that you get are not totally due to fertilizer, that a lot of it is due to the soil. There are microbes in the soil that produce nitrogen independently of the rhizobium. There are rhizobium that work with the plants, and it's the combination of that plus some non-exchangeable ammonia that we don't test for, but we know it's there. All of those things can contribute to it. So what does this mean? So there's 400-pound yield. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you have 30 cent, if you have 30 cent navies, for example, that's 400 times 30 cents is $120. And then the amount of N that you're applying, 90 pounds at 50 cents, let's say a pound, it's $45. It's not a bad return. You spend 45, you get 75 net out of it, and that's not bad. So that's where nitrogen RECs are coming from. So let's see. So why doesn't that happen? So what did I just do? There we go. All right. So if you break down the Minnesota data, there were two really sandy sites at Becker and Staples. Those are the two lines at the top. They're sandboxes and they're heavily irrigated. Dan doesn't know. Dan Kaiser, my colleague over in Minnesota, doesn't know right now. I'm sure he'll find out what the nitrate content of that water is. Uh, my guess is it's not zero, but we don't really know. Uh, but the other two sites are not sandboxes, and they peak out somewhere in that 100 pound range roughly. And even and this is another thing. It didn't really matter what the yield potential of the site was, what the environment gave us for yield. The peak of the curve is pretty close to the same. And Dan told me in an email actually this morning that he's strongly considering just dropping the yield goal part of the dry bean recommendation, and I totally agree with that. The only place we really had it was in irrigation, where I wasn't really sure. But the dry land, I was pretty sure we didn't need that yield thing in there. It just messes everything up, and the yield isn't related to N rate anyway. As you can see, the relative yield is important. So there are three possible nitrogen strategies that you could do. One is do nothing, and you shake your head. Well, why would I say that? So I was in Wells County tour one day, long time ago, and a farmer, I gave my spiel, and I didn't have all these three at that time. I just had inoculated or fertilized, and don't do both because it doesn't make sense. He took me to his farm. He hadn't fertilized in forever. He hasn't inoculated in forever, but he'd been growing dry beans in a rotation for quite some time. He had beautiful soil. You could stick your, it was what, July? It was July. And you could stick your arm up to the elbow and actually reach underneath the plant and lift them carefully out of the ground. The soil would just fall off of it. It wasn't really sandy. It was just really well crumbly aggregated. And there were scads. I stopped cutting nodules at 200. So there's some farms that don't really have any stresses on them where you can do nothing if you've been in a dry bean recommendation or dry bean program in a while and just be fine. And there's probably a few of you out in the audience that know exactly what I'm talking about. Then you can inoculate, but inoculation is by itself is subject to all those hot, cold, wet, dry things. Where you could fertilize up to 100 pounds of N and then take the soil test in and your credits from that. I don't think there'd be any credits on dry beans really, but use your soil test in order to modify that. And that's really all you need. And you can see from the Minnesota data, good grief, we're going way over 3,000 pounds just with this minimal amount of nitrogen. So don't go into debt trying to get that last pound of bean out of it, because I don't think you need to. So that's nitrogen. Not a lot of change from what we said before. The dry beans aren't a really great responder to phosphate either. These are our recommendations. In North Dakota, we use the Olson soil test because we have fields that have high pH and low pH, all in the same, and the Olson test does a pretty good job of representing each one of those. So we're looking at maybe rates from 30 pounds of P2O5 an acre to 10. I mean, it's really just not that much. So this is Minnesota data. These the sites where Dan had his phosphate tests weren't particularly low, but they weren't high either. And blacks, navies, two different locations, one at Crookston, one at Lamberton, Southwest Minnesota. No significant difference due to rate at all. So our recommendations, it peaked out about 20 pounds of P2O5, which is pretty darn close to what our recommendations are here in North Dakota. So as far as the phosphate goes, the recommendations for a very long time were just to broadcast and don't put anything with the seed. But, fortunately, people just don't go with the assumptions. And one of the, the meaning of research is to look at it again. And so Greg Endress and his colleagues at Carrington have looked at it again. They've researched it and found that if you're planting into a moist soil, that around 2.5 gallon of 1034 or some other kind of low salt, well, 1034 is a salt product, but the low salt products, it doesn't matter which one, they both have similar safety. They can be applied in a moist soil conditions, but don't apply it in a dry soil. All right, so this is some data from Carrington. I got to get rid of this box. Soil P was 5 to 10, which is low to medium. In-furrow gave a significant yield increase, banded to the side to be, a couple inches off to the side, about the level with the seed, about the same amount. a 3 to 6 gallon per acre. The 6, I don't think you don't want to do that. But a little bit of an increase, certainly a profitable increase. And then with tree trials over a number of years, the broadcast didn't give them a yield increase, but the info of the band did. So this is totally contrary to what we understood 30 years ago. So as long as the soil is moist, you should be able to do this, and you should be able to gain some yield. And this is a nice way to put your zinc on too. It doesn't take an extra trip or anything. So the caveat, let me see, the caution, that's a better word. The caution is that if you have a very dry spring like you did in 2021, you don't want to do this. If you have some space, some distance between the seed and the band, you're good, but don't try putting it on in the band when the soil is very dry at planting time and there is no prospect for rain that afternoon. I don't think it really kills the stand. It really decreases the stand. Only apply the fertilizer in furrow at low rates, 2.5 gallon acre, 1034. For me, I dilute it with water a little bit so you get a more even stream. It's not really as safe. Well, it is in a way, because if you got a glob of fertilizer right on the seed, that's not a good thing. So if you dilute it a little bit, you're less likely to have that happen. So that's phosphate. So potassium, not a big responder. Minnesota did some work with it this year, and they showed no response. Our recommendations are that if you have a soil test K of greater than 80 ppm, which is really pretty low. I mean, that would be really low if you had corn, for example. No need for application. Soil test between 0 to 40, that'd be the really low stuff. Apply 50 pounds K2O per acre, and then from 41 to 80, apply 20. So not a whole lot. There aren't going to be very many soils in the state that have K tests that low. And we don't really have any information on the K and the clay chemistry, so I can't really uh, respond to that hardly at all, if at all. So that brings us to zinc. Our general zinc recommendations are to use the soil test, use a DDPA soil test, which is what we use in the state. Agvice, NDSU, any soil test in the state or over and across the border in Minnesota uses a DDPA test developed in Colorado State. Way long time ago. Soil test is less than 1 ppm. Small rate as zinc in the starter band will alleviate any deficiency. Rates of chelated zinc, 1 pint to a quart, that's plenty. 9 to 12% zinc doesn't seem to matter really a whole lot. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but the zinc and the sulfur are kind of embedded in each other with the Carrington research. So I want to bring this out. We get almost no sulfur from the air. There's no such thing as zero in biology, so I can't say zero, but way less than we used to. The map on the left is the year 2000 sulfur deposition across the continental United States. In North Dakota, you can see the coal-fired plants along the Missouri River and the coal-fired plant across the border in Saskatchewan in the northwest part of the state. You might be able to even pick out a few of the sugar beet processing plants that run on coal along the Red River. But if we go to 21 years past that, you don't see any of that. It's all gone. What, 2 pounds? 2 pounds of sulfate is SO4. I mean, that's sulfate. So the sulfur is way less than that. We get less than a pound per acre per year from the sulfur. And we used to get maybe 4 to 5 many years ago, but that's been a long time ago. So it's a thing. Our yields are a lot higher, our demand is a lot higher, and our sources are limited. We get to buy it instead of having it for free. That's kind of how it goes. We don't have any firm sulfur recommendations for dry beans, so this is what I would say. Sulfur response is most likely if the weather in the fall or early spring has been wet. On sandy loam or coarser soils and upland positions where they've been leaching. If you're going to use sulfur, don't use elemental sulfur. It just doesn't oxidize quickly enough. Use sulfate sources, and for God's sake, don't put ammonium thiosulfate with the seed unless you want to call your insurance agent and lie to them. So this is some data from Carrington, 4 years, and not much excitement there. This is the untreated check, in-furrow 1034.0, not a lot of bump there, and then not a lot of bump with the foliar zinc later on either. No statistical difference as far as I can tell with those 4 years. This is another 4-year study, untreated check, in-furrow 1034.0 plus zinc, and then the in-furrow zinc plus a foliar fertilizer, and this annoying thing right here. They used a product from Winfield United, and I didn't look up the active ingredient, but you're free to do that. Max NS at 2 quarts an acre doing R2 to R5. There was 1 year out of 4 where the effect was statistically significant. So I don't know. If you do the economics of it, maybe you're going to break even. But it's not very exciting, just to say. And this is another 4-year study, I think. And untreated check, there was only 1 year where there was a statistical increase, and that was with the in-furrow 1034 plus zinc plus foliar sulfate. So again, it's something there, but not a lot. It's really, I think if you talk to Greg, he's kind of been kind of frustrated that even though they go into soils that are pretty low in zinc, they don't see a really great yield increase to zinc fertilizer. I just kind of wonder if maybe Ken Grafton and Elwana Sonero with their breeding program. I'm not sure how much zinc background they have in their trials, but it's possible that they've kind of been breeding for better zinc utilization through their breeding program. I can't think of any other explanation really. So there's something there, but it's not huge. One thing that is huge is salinity tolerance. Dry beans are very, very sensitive to high levels of salinity, and really not even that high levels of salinity. The yield increases start when you get to about 0.6 EC, millimoles per centimeter, and then decline rapidly from there. Once you get to an EC of 2, which is not all that unusual, you're down to less than half of the yield potential. So screen your fields carefully. I know fields, and I'm not going to embarrass anybody by bringing a few up, but I bet you know some in your neighborhood that year after year, whenever they put in the dry beans, there's this strip along the road that's 150 feet wide where nothing grows. Well, why in the world don't you just put it into oats or barley? Surely it's got to have some value there. But you're spending money on fertilizer, you're spending money for seed. Nothing ever comes up. I just don't get it. So, there's no law that says that you have to plant a whole quarter section to one crop. Go ahead and put 10 acres of barley or oats, which are very, very salt tolerant, along the road. Get something, sell it to somebody, and actually make some profit from it. All right, so this is what we know, and this is what I don't know. The N-rate data from NDSU was conducted on Navy and Pinot. The work so far with Dan has been on blacks and navies, and they go pretty alongside, even though the yields now are a lot more than they were back in 95 and 96. The nitrogen rates that are essential for the highest yield and the highest profit are really, really close to the same as what we've had in our recommendations right now. Our potassium data is based on older experiments. I think it might be time for an update. I don't know, really, except for Dan's data just lately. I don't know who else has done this. And I think you need better direction on zinc and sulfur, and there's some opportunities there for whoever comes in on my position. Well, I know who comes in. I'll mention that in a minute. There are inoculation studies that are ongoing by Dr. Barney Geddes. I'm not sure if he receives funding from the dry bean associations or not, but he's wonderful, and got a chance to really visit with him in depth at a tour a couple weeks ago. But he has some amazing things going on, and he shares to me that there's a great disconnect between new and improved inoculants that are being marketed and their ability to compete. These things have to compete with whatever is in the soil already for them to have any value at all. And right now, that's not really going on. So there's my contact information until August 2nd. I'll be retiring August 2nd, and NDSU has already hired my replacement. His name is Brady Gadel. In May, he will be Dr. Brady Gadel. He's worked as the soil health technician for the last 4 years or so. He's been working master's PhD under myself and Tom DeSutter during that period of time, and he has soil fertility recommendations have resulted in our new 2-row malting barley nitrogen recommendations. He has a wealth of knowledge. He has international experience. He spent several months working on a farm in Northwest Germany. A great, energetic, skillful, knowledgeable, articulate young person that will be a great asset at NDSU for the next 30 to 40 years. So with that, that's it.